Welcoming you back to another edition of the Edge podcast. Publisher Brenden Slaughter here for BeaversEdge.com, joined by Beavers Edge recruiting analyst Dylan Callaghan-Croley as we're coming to you guys following a couple high impact pieces on the recruiting trail for Oregon State. On Christmas, they landed Gabarri Johnson out of the transfer portal. Quarterback going to join Giovanni McCoy in that quarterback room as the offseason additions. So we'll be breaking down what he brings to the table, as well as today, the day after Christmas, as Dylan and I are recording this podcast, Jordan Anderson, a big-time receiver in the 2024 recruiting class, a bit of a late addition, but a worthy addition nonetheless. So we're going to be breaking that all down. Dylan, happy holidays to you, my man. I can still see the festivities behind you, man. Love to see it.
Yep.
And yeah, man, hope you had a good holiday. And Oregon State maintained. I don't know if they really had much of a Christmas, Dylan, because it kept like they were still going after the recruiting trail pretty hard.
Yeah, that it's been nonstop for the Beavers. It seems like since last week with signing day, and they continue. I mean, even before signing day, since over the last 7 to 10 days, it's been nonstop for them, and they added perhaps the two biggest commitments of the last 10 days or so in the last 2 days with Gabarri Johnson and now Jordan Anderson. I mean, those are two really high impact, high potential guys. Gabarri Johnson honestly will compete for the starting quarterback job,
Right.
but Jordan Anderson, let's not bury the lead. This is a top 100 recruit. I think we have him at 76,
Mm.
75 in the Rivals top 100, top 250, 71. Number
Yeah, there you go.
71
Even
nationally,
more impressive.
number 9 in the state of California. It's number 17 wide receiver. I mean, this is a high potential, high ceiling type prospect who can compete potentially day one to be a starting wide receiver for the Beavers next season.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously an absolute stud. And you talk about the guys that didn't necessarily sign in the early window. He was a guy that we knew was going to be someone who took a decision. You and I knew it was down to San Diego State or Oregon State for him. And then you obviously mentioned how high of a level of a recruit he was. Um, you know, Dylan, is this a guy who they get without Gabarri Johnson?
Um, that's a good question. I would say I think landing a guy like Gabarri Johnson does absolutely help.
Mm,
But they knew they were in a good spot for Gabarri Johnson for a while here. But
sure.
I think it's more about selling him on the plan going forward because he did sign with the Beavers. He signed last week. He is officially part of the program, and he announced his decision today. So I mean, he signed technically before Gabarri Johnson officially committed to
Sure.
Oregon State.
Sure.
Now,
Good point.
could they have known, ahead of time that Johnson was going to make his way to Corvallis? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the biggest kept secret in college football. I mean, it was quite widely accepted by us and around the industry that Oregon State was, going to be the favorite for Johnson. And I'm sure they talked about that and they talked about McCoy and what else they can bring in. But I think this is all about selling him on the vision of what he can be at Oregon State, coming into that wide receiver room, which is still a good wide receiver room, and making an instant impact as a as a potential true freshman next season.
Absolutely. And, let's go ahead and start with Gabarri since, again, he was first. Dylan, obviously we knew a while ago, Beavers Edgers on the damn
Sure.
board, premium subscribers knew that this was something that was in the works for, I want to say a week, couple weeks now, but
Yeah.
it was kind of quiet. We hadn't heard a whole lot. We knew that, he was more likely to come back to the West Coast. And, ultimately we kind of talked about it when we talked about Giovanni McCoy, the Idaho
Sure.
transfer in our last podcast, just how, adding in Giovanni McCoy was not going to likely deter adding in another quarterback prospect to the room, whether that turned out to be, Malik Murphy, who ultimately committed to Duke, or Gabarri Johnson, who, ultimately committed to Oregon State. Dylan, let's talk
Right.
a little bit about, the fact that I think maybe a lot of folks, maybe, I don't want to say forgot about Gabarri, but kind of, he went to Missouri, didn't play at all his freshman year, was kind of more of an under the radar for the last 12 months after being, really highly recruited coming out of Tacoma, Washington here on the West Coast, and obviously a Washingtonian. Do you think it's one of those things where maybe going back to his recruitment, he maybe went a little further away from home than he wanted, and then, didn't quite work out at Missouri, and now had a big time opportunity to come back and start at a, maybe not the biggest school on the West Coast, obviously, but a really good program, very close to home, and a program that did recruit him coming out of high school.
No, yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I think there's definitely that aspect of come back home, or at least close to home. Obviously, not Washington, but Corvallis is pretty close, all things considered. Yeah, I think there's definitely that aspect because you think about it, as soon as he entered the transfer portal, it was pretty much assumed and safely assumed that it was going to be Oregon State who
Right.
ultimately lands him. I mean, he entered the portal within 10 minutes. We were getting text messages saying, "Hey, watch out for Gabarri
Yeah.
Johnson. This is one that's probably going to end up well for the Beavers." But you spoke about that opportunity, and you're right. He is now going to have to, go up against a really good quarterback to win the starting quarterback
Right.
job in Giovanni McCoy. We talked about McCoy extensively in our last podcast. We've talked about him extensively on the side. That's a guy that, despite the Idaho brand being attached to him, is a high caliber quarterback who can make a big impact very early on in his Oregon State career. When he committed last week, he was assumed to be the favorite to win the starting quarterback job. You could probably argue that he's still probably the favorite, but this gives him some legitimate
Yeah.
competition at that quarterback job. And that's nothing against Gabarri Johnson. I think Gabarri Johnson's a very high upside guy, but the opportunity, to come back closer to home, I think played a big factor. The opportunity that he's going to have a chance to be, uh, you know, if not the starting quarterback, the primary backup quarterback for for this year, and he will have the opportunity, to earn that starting quarterback role. And we've seen Oregon State use two quarterbacks. Well, there's the old
Hmm.
adage: if you got two quarterbacks, you have no quarterbacks. But I think if whoever is the starter, I think we will still see a little bit of the backup, like kind of like we did with Aiden Childs this year. And I think there's a lot of upside for Johnson. I do think there's still development to go there. We haven't seen him play a game in over a year. The last time he played a football game was his senior year of high school, where he posted good
Sure.
numbers for Lincoln up in Washington: 2,300 passing yards, 25 touchdowns, 68.4% completion percentage, and he ran for over 1,600 yards. So I mean, that's a true dual threat
Yeah.
quarterback that they're adding. But I mean, he hasn't played in a year. It's going to take him a little bit once he gets into a game to, kind of get back into that um, mindset, get the rust off him. But I think you have to be excited if you're an Oregon State fan about the potential of this quarterback room, especially heading into a primary Mountain West Conference schedule. I think this is a quarterback room that can play at a high level against a majority of the opponents that Oregon State's going to have next year.
No, that's a great point. And, you mentioned his high school stats. I mean, there's a lot to like about what he did in high school, Dylan. And, you mentioned obviously his numbers, his yards. I think to what Ryan Gunderson had at UCLA with Dorian Thompson Robinson,
Right.
DTR, and, the true dual threatness of that nature, I think it's very plausible to assume that Oregon State's quarterback is probably going to be more featured. I mean, DJ was featured, but
Yeah.
DJ was featured this year in a unique way. He was kind of that, hey, here's the guy that's 6'5", 250 pounds. He's going to get you 3-4 yards.
Unique talent.
Now, I think they
Yeah.
could have a guy who could run more of that read option style stuff that we saw at
Yeah.
UCLA with DTR. So that's something to keep an eye on. Dylan and I mentioned Giovanni McCoy, not quite as much of a dual threat, but I think could be molded into a guy who's athletic enough to make plays
Yeah.
depending on how it works.
Absolutely.
But like Dylan said, I mean, 1,600 yards and 21 touchdowns, on the ground in his senior year. I mean, that's a lot of yards, and over
Yeah.
2,500 yards rushing for his career. I mean, he put up numbers. And want to go back to his high school recruiting, Dylan, just for a moment.
Sure.
Oregon State fans, rightfully so, definitely were bummed out when, Oregon State lost DJU and Aiden Childs out of this
Yeah.
crop of quarterbacks this year, Dylan.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's understandable. Aiden Childs was the number 3 ranked dual threat quarterback in the 2023 class.
Yeah.
The consolation, Gabarri Johnson was the 5th ranked quarterback in the
Yeah.
2023 class. So while losing Aiden Childs, maybe DJU was never meant to be more than a 1-year rental or what have you, but Aiden Childs losing that future, you could do a lot worse than going from, a guy with Childs' future to a guy with Johnson's future, which again, really to me, would we look at these guys any differently, Dylan, if it was Childs that didn't play a year at Oregon State and it was Gabarri Johnson who got, regular run like Childs did routinely throughout the year. So I think, perspective is everything, but
Yeah.
just simply going back to rankings, these were guys who were not very far apart, just, a year and some change ago.
Yeah, and you know, losing Childs is going to be one, especially if he goes or to East Lansing and lights it up. That's going to be a hard one for everybody to
Sure.
swallow, understandably so. And he has. I was talking to somebody else today about what I think Childs is going to be at Michigan State, and I said, there's still development to go there, but yeah, this year is probably already a top half of the Big Ten quarterback, so that is understandably a big loss. But like you said, this is, I mean, for losing what they lost in that room this offseason, this is a pretty good way to bounce back.
Just a pivot, I would say, a good
Yeah.
pivot.
McCoy, maybe doesn't have the upside of a DJU, but I think he has a similar floor to DJU. I think he's going to go out there. He's going to be efficient. He's going to be effective. He can extend plays with his legs. He's accurate. I mean, we talked about we talked about his skill set. And I encourage people to go back and listen to that podcast or go over to
Mm-hmm.
OregonState.rivals.com and read our extensive scouting report on McCoy, but also all the transfer portal additions Oregon State has, and we're pumping out a few more here over the next few
Mm-hmm.
days. But McCoy has a high floor, absolutely, and does have a notably high ceiling as well, which I think he could just be scratching the surface of, especially when you just consider they added a guy like Jordan Anderson. And I know he hasn't signed yet, but if they can sign Malachi Durant, Jordan Anderson and Malachi Durant is a hell of a 1-2 combination at wide receiver in the 2024 recruiting class. But Johnson has, incredible upside as well. Maybe not as much of a polished player as Childs is right now, but I think he can, become one of the better quarterbacks
Sure.
in Oregon State's, whatever you want to call it, of schools,
Sure.
whatever we do call that. But I think he could be one of the better quarterbacks at his level.
Sure.
Um, and I think that dual threat capabilities, yeah, we saw a lot of what Ryan Gunderson was able to do with Dorian Thompson-Robinson at UCLA. And yeah, he was running a lot of Chip Kelly's offense, but still, at the end of the day, we saw a dual threat quarterback at UCLA have a lot of success. Then they went to a less, developed quarterback, less dual threat quarterback in Moore, and
Sure.
it just did not work out this season. So I think it definitely can be an advantage to Oregon State to have two guys who are similar, not the exact, but similar in that they can extend plays with their legs. McCoy being more of an extender and improviser per se, while Johnson provides you, that, like we said, true dual threat capabilities in which you can call a lot of read options. You can call, a
Right.
lot of QB draws and design QB runs. And who knows where he is in his development as a passer? That's the tough thing to say. We haven't been able to watch him in practice in Missouri.
Sure.
We haven't seen him in game action. He was pretty good at Lincoln as a senior, 68.4 completion percentage. But he's going to facing a college football defense is a lot different than the defenses he was facing up there in Tacoma.
So, obviously, I'll be perfectly honest, Dylan. I can confidently say I didn't watch a whole lot of Missouri football this season.
Right.
What was their quarterback? I'm asking you off the cuff if you knew, but I
Sure.
wasn't quite sure what their quarterback situation was. Like, was it a situation where they didn't bring anybody back and like he lost a quarterback competition as part of an open room, or something where they brought back somebody? Because you think about, like, again, could Gabarri Johnson have been like a Dante Moore, someone who was thrown into the fire? A little bit this last year we've seen when that has paid off and where it hasn't paid off. obviously for young quarterbacks just in the mix. So that's a lot to see. But going back to the room as a whole, I like what they did in the sense that you go get a guy in Gabarri Johnson who was a big time recruit, one of the top dual threats in the class. You give him a chance after, a situation at Missouri that maybe didn't work out for him for whatever reason. He gets a chance to come home and kind of prove, real kind of blue collar, prove put in the work kind of mentality that fits Oregon State well. Then you bring in Giovanni McCoy, who right now you probably got a lot of people who are, at least I'm not going to say questioning, but just throwing the question out there, can he compete at a higher level, right?
Right.
And I think that's also something, they kind of brought in two guys that for very different reasons are going to like really put in the work and kind of want to attack that quarterback battle, for lack of better
Right.
terms, compared to a year ago, Dylan, when you know, Jonathan Smith and his staff, I know that's kind of a swear word these days. Can't really say that, but his staff, we all kind of knew without knowing all year long. They're like, it's an open quarterback competition, but we all knew that DJU was going to be the guy in that room come September, Dylan, barring
Right.
something crazy, even with Aiden Childs in that room.
Right.
So now I'm curious to see what it's going to do for just kind of the room as a whole and the competition as a whole to truly have another year where it's like it really is anybody's ball game back there.
Right. And you were asking about the Missouri quarterback
Yeah,
situation. Yeah. So Missouri, they got one. They got I don't know if he's going to declare for the draft this year. I think he's eligible, but I guess he returns next year. But they have Brady Cook as their starting quarterback right now. For an SEC quarterback, he played really, really well.
there you go.
And I know I made that sound as if SEC quarterbacks are bad, but that's for playing in the SEC. He played really
Yeah,
well.
gotcha.
66.4 completion percentage or 3,000 yards, 20 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. So he could return for next season, but I think what not probably convinced Johnson to maybe look elsewhere was they did in the 2022 recruiting class sign top 100 prospect Sam Horn,
Mm,
um, who I think it's been cleared with Missouri that he's their number two guy right now. He is the heir apparent to Brady Cook,
sure.
very similar skill set. Now it's also worth noting that I'm Kirby Moore is the offensive coordinator there at Missouri, somebody who we had on our
We did.
head coach and hot board, or perhaps
I
offensive
think it
coordinator
was
hot board.
brief. I think we had a couple different
Yeah,
references to him, but thrown out there, obviously.
yeah, but obviously he's their offense coordinator. And you look at Cook and Horn, they're more pro style passers, not really dual threat guys. Cook does have dual threat abilities. He did run the ball, 90. I wouldn't say dual threat abilities. He has some lengths, but he ran the ball 94 times this year.
Sure.
Horn ran the ball 3 times, but they're not true dual threat quarterbacks. They're more pocket passers, pro style guys. So I do wonder if perhaps it was also he wasn't a true fit in the system of Kirby Moore as well, and that go somewhere that perhaps if there would be a better fit, as we said with Ryan Gunderson, who had a very good success with Dorian Thompson Robinson at UCLA, a much similar player skill set wise to Gabarri Johnson.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, stay tuned to Dylan and I on that quarterback room. We're going to keep talking about it quite a bit, but we'd be remiss if we didn't switch gears and mention the biggest news of today. And obviously, Gabarri Johnson's commitment was huge on Christmas for a lot of reasons. But Dylan, Jordan Anderson, big time commitment today. And you wrote about it a little bit as well, or rather, just Rivals and all of us wrote about it
Yeah.
collectively. And I say you, me, and Adam Gorney, who have kind of been at the top of this, BeaversEdge.com. These are high school. Let's paint the deck a little bit, Dylan. These are the kind of recruits that Oregon State is not typically in the mix for. And then additionally, let's talk a little bit about Jordan Anderson from the sense of like, if you had told somebody, just a casual observer, that Oregon State would sign the number 2 wide receiver in the
Yeah.
state of California per Rivals. Again, everything kind of goes up and down. You can subjective, what have you. In amidst all the, playing in a different conference next season, their coach leaving, like that would have been pretty unbelievable. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss Oregon State, but they typically will get those kind of higher talented guys, maybe out of the transfer portal. And just to kind of go back and look, let's look at a few of what I like to call the Oregon State greats, recruiting wise at wide receiver in recent memory. Isaiah Hodgins, who's obviously with the New York Giants now, 165. He was the 26th best receiver nationally in 2017. And then even Brandon Cooks, who again 4-star coming in 240 national, 26th the position. Dylan, how good of a wide receiver is this? And should Oregon State fans be popping some celebratory champagne of sorts?
Yeah, I mean, these are the wide receiver talents that coaches and fans dream of adding to their wide receiver room. Jordan Anderson is a kid who can step in day one and compete to be a starting wide receiver for Oregon State. Adam Gorney I won't give away his entire scout report, but Adam Gorney says that he could be the best wide receiver in the state of California this recruiting cycle, which I mean just speaks to the level of talent that Jordan Anderson possesses. 6 foot, 162. This kid isn't the biggest. He has nice size. He has nice, size height wise, but 162 pounds is still on the smaller side. But he has just great speed and ability to stretch the field a ton, and that should be able to translate pretty well to the collegiate level. And I haven't been able to really get the full intel of why he backed off that Oregon State commitment. And for a 4-star talent, you necessarily wouldn't expect it to be down to Oregon State and San Diego State. But if you're an Oregon State fan, if you're an Oregon State coach, you don't care what circumstances led to
Sure.
that. All you care about it. Well, if you're an Oregon State coach or fan, all you care about is that Jordan Anderson, a top 100 prospect, has committed to your program, has signed his letter of
Right.
intent, and is going to be a Beaver. We have messages out to see if he is going to be enrolling early or if he's going to be enrolling in the summer. But
Sure.
either way, the countdown at this point is on of when Jordan Anderson is going to become a Beaver. If he gets here, in a couple of weeks, that's absolutely huge. But even if not, this is a kid who could come in the summer and be competing to be a starting wide receiver. If not start, he's going to be a very key rotational piece for the Beavers next fall. Gives them a tremendous upside at the wide receiver position, and somebody I think we can see put up big stats right away.
Give me a comp, Dylan, because obviously, you got a guy you mentioned 6 foot, 162, definitely not like a pure like even the guys I mentioned, very different from like a Isaiah Hodgins who was, 6'4" and more of a target receiver than necessarily a you know, playmaker in between the tackles. Like we saw Brandon Cooks was obviously a little more undersized, but was lightning quick. And, Brandon Cooks obviously won the Bolitnikoff, a handful
Yeah.
of years ago now too. But, Dylan, just going back to, him real quick, you mentioned it in your story as well that, he's the first top 100 commitment since Isaac Seumalo in 2012.
Yeah.
And that's like, to me, it's not that unbelievable because that's, again, we talked about DJU and how if he had picked the Beavers out of high school, probably would have broke all those things too. But again, I think this really speaks to Oregon State's recruiting ability, Dylan. And then maybe number two, obviously you mentioned why he backed off his commitment to Oregon. I said, don't be afraid to tell Beaver fans that. I'm sure they'll enjoy, their little recruiting win of sorts that they
Right.
took a 4-star receiver from their rival. But what
And
is
all, and
this?
all,
Oh,
and
go
at the
ahead.
end of
Yeah,
at the end of the day, when you look on the profile, all you're gonna see, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is that decommitted from Oregon, committed to Oregon State. So at the
yeah,
end of the day, that I mean, it's kind of like baseball. If it's a bloop single to second base or a line drive, at 110 miles per hour, up the middle, no matter how it got there and
yeah,
got on
exactly.
first, it's still a single.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to that point, obviously, I think it just speaks a lot, Dylan, to It'll be very interesting to see what his recruitment was like as we talk to him a little bit more. But two big takeaways I have from this. All I remember recently was there had been Dylan, and actually you can as well with me. There had been
Yeah,
not quite so much this cycle, but just recently, there had maybe been a little bit of criticism of receivers coach Kefense Hinson and who he was
sure,
bringing in at the receiver room prior to
sure.
maybe this cycle. I think this cycle he really kind of struck it home. We really like Malachi Durant, really like Eddie Freehoff. Expect, at least one, if not both those guys to ultimately end up with the Beavers. But, then you mentioned the fact that Kefense was named interim head coach. He doesn't go with Jonathan Smith to Michigan State as they had, receivers coach that, worked out there and all that. Is that another kind of one of those right place, right time things, Dylan, where Kevin Hinson had probably been recruiting him all year anyway, and then as soon as he got, the interim job and then ultimately was staying on, like, does Oregon State land Jordan Anderson if Kefense Hinson was, say, taken to Michigan State?
No, I
Right, and
think
I don't think so. I don't think so.
right. I think as his position coach, that's probably one of the more, important arguments in this, or important aspects in this recruitment.
Sure,
The fact that, he's been involved in this recruitment for a while. Obviously he committed to Oregon pretty earlier this year.
sure.
So I don't know what the communication was like between then and the decommitment, but they had that previous build relationship for sure. And I absolutely agree that without Hinson, I don't know if this happens. Um, and I think you also consider, Gunderson. I don't think UCLA ever offered him, but Gunderson coming from Los Angeles. I don't think, not that far from Newport Beach. So Gunderson had to be, pretty familiar with Anderson as well. And I'm sure Anderson was somewhat familiar with UCLA at the time as well. So I think Hinton absolutely helps, and I wouldn't be surprised if Gunderson helped this as well.
Absolutely. And you
Uh,
talked about, or go ahead. Sorry.
you're asking for a player comp, and
Yeah.
it's tough. I don't know his exact speeds, which
Okay.
makes this a little tougher. But based off what I've been able to see on film, similar, not exact. So I'm not saying this guy's going to be this guy, but he to a degree does remind me watching to somebody that I have the opportunity to watch every Sunday in Devontae Smith. Kind of
I
that
like that.
that
Yeah.
he does. You can tell he has really good speed. He's a great route runner. He has consistent, soft but yet strong hands.
Sure.
You can tell he has the full skill set as a wide receiver.
Right.
Very similar to Devontae Smith, who may not be the biggest player. Devontae Smith, 6 foot, whatever, 150 pounds on a good
Right.
day.
Yeah. Not the
And,
biggest guy. No, not at all.
exactly, and I think that's a semi decent comp for Anderson. I'm not going to say he's going to come in and be a Devontae Smith type talent. He's not going to win the Heisman, but I think there's similarities enough to make a similarity comp there.
Right. And the last kind of thing I want to mention on Anderson, Dylan, something that I kind of found interesting is that Jordan Anderson obviously ended up, I believe, you said Newport
Beach,
Harbor. Yeah, yeah, Newport Beach, Newport Harbor.
yeah, Newport,
But
Iowa, but yeah,
began his collegiate career down at Millikan in Long Beach. So kind of ended up going to kind of up his competition, I think, a little
yeah.
bit. And I know that, Milliken's had some decent talent guys come through there too, but nevertheless, like I'm always curious at a guy who maybe looks to improve his high school competition or just, go to a school that's maybe going to utilize him more, right? Or any
Right.
number of things. So I found that interesting, and he was still able to put up some good stats, and I really do think that your comp is on it, and my way to what I would contribute to that is I think he's just electric. I think he's electric
Yeah.
with the ball in his hands, and I think in
Game
addition to
changer.
everything you said, I'm curious to see what that speed looks like with these two eyeballs right here. Once we decide to, or once we finally get to see him in Corvallis, but yeah, definitely going to be an exciting piece. And I mean, Dylan, I'll ask you this to close it out. Is this about the culmination with McCoy, Gabarri Johnson, and now Jordan Anderson, the recruiting class? Is this as good of a situation as you could have asked for if you were a Beaver fan? If I checked in with you, say, you know, a week after the conclusion of the regular season.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, this recruiting class was in some dire straits. It was looking
Yep.
things were looking really bad, and I think through the combination of what we've been saying, they're the Moneyball type
Right.
mindset with the class, and then
Adapt or die, man. Adapt or
right, and then
die.
what they brought in with the transfer portal. Yeah, I mean, this has been a class. The class, the class we won't be able to tell for a while,
Sure.
and there is a chance that the guys they have added don't pan out, and
Sure. That
that's and
happens all the
that's
time.
and that's a risk they're willing to take at this point. Um, Somewhat out of necessity because you do have to sign a good amount of kids here, but I think they took enough high potential, high production kids. That's what we've been stressing is these are kids with deficiencies. Yes, these are kids that are going to take time. Yes, but they're all high production players. They've been able to do it for multiple years at the high school level. And then in the transfer portal, they've gone guys who are going to be able to come in, make an impact pretty quickly if it's not year one next year as well. And then, yeah, with Jordan Anderson, I think that's the culmination of, kind of saving it. The class isn't going to look good numbers wise or rankings
Sure.
wise, but I think we can look back on this class as perhaps as one that kind of kept Oregon State afloat. Maybe in a year or so, there's a little bit of a down year because you did lose quite a bit of talent. Now you're replacing some of that talent, but I think this class overall is going to help Oregon State remain successful going forward.
Yeah.
Will they win 9, 10 games every year? I don't know,
We'll
but
see.
I think it's going to help the program at the very least remain competitive, and it's going to allow it to be allowed to be used as a building block. But Jordan Anderson, I mean, those are the type of talents that you get. You showcase them when you have them, and you just hope to continue building off that. And if you can, go, hit a home run with Jordan Anderson once he arrives in Corvallis, it's going to lead to more success on the recruiting trail.
Absolutely. And again, make sure to stay locked to BeaversEdge.com as Dylan and I are going to be breaking down everything with Jordan Anderson and obviously Gabarri Johnson and everything to come. We also got the Sun Bowl coming up. I know it's crazy to think the Beavers still have a bowl game to play, but yes, we have a bowl game coming up this week. Friday, 11 a.m. The Sun Bowl is going to take place, so make sure to stay locked to BeaversEdge.com for that. Big shout out to Dylan Callaghan-Croley for this edition of the Edge podcast. Make sure to stay locked. BeaversEdge.com will continue to bring you continuing coverage of Oregon State's offseason.